Hello, I would like to start this video by saying thank you to the people who are supporting me on Patreon, and that is Emma in America, thank you Emma, and Susan in Australia, thank you Susan. And if you would like to support Grant Loves Books on Patreon, there is a link below. Hi, it is April the 30th today. My beautiful girlfriend has gone to visit her family for a month. She's gone to Japan, so I'm here on my own. If it appears that I'm wallowing in my own filth, well, you're not quite wrong.
We're going to get fucked up and monged out and messed up and dicked over.
We want to wallow in our own filth, Mark. Have a good old fucking wallow.
If you happen to live in the greater Vancouver area and you had a compulsion to do some light or moderate housekeeping, please feel free to write me a message. We'll set it up. And if you wanted to wear one of those French maid outfits, things could get really boisterous. Kampai! April, the cruelest month, according to T.S. Eliot. April was not a very good month for books for me. Margaret Lawrence, The Fire Dwellers. I did a review. Maybe you can see it over there. It's over there. Margaret Lawrence is my favorite Canadian author. This novel, The Fire Dwellers, is the third novel in a series called the Manawaca series. If you're in America or Australia or New Zealand or England, Ireland, and you want to get a sense of what Canadian literature is, the Manawaca series. That is what I will always hold up as the best of Canadian literature. It's my opinion, but you know, I have to have one. Book number 2, Favours by Bernice Rubens. This novel actually had another name. Previously, it was known as The 5-Year Sentence, and for some reason, they changed the name to Favours. Last year, one of my favorite novels was by Bernice Rubens, and it was called The Elected Member. It is wonderful and heartbreaking. So I was really happy to find this, in the secondhand shop for just $2.50. But it's not very good. It's like she started off with an interesting idea and started writing and thought, well, okay, let's see where it goes. And once having written 100 pages, she thought, well, it's not going terribly well. Perhaps something will happen at the end to salvage. It'd be a shame to waste 100 pages. And then on reaching the end, there's just not much there. The main idea is that there is a woman who retires and she is given a 5-year diary as her retirement gift. And this leads her to meeting a man who is charging her for physical attention. And over the course of 5 years, she gives him all of the money she has for, nothing graphic, like holding hands, little kissing, little hugging, touching the hair. And all of these favors cost 25 cents, 50 cents, a pound. And she just slowly gives all of her money to this man. And she thinks that one day he will marry her. And in that way, it's quite a sad novel. It's just not very satisfying. It is not a very complex idea, and it follows a very logical progression, and it arrives at this very obvious, miserable conclusion. Pnin, Vladimir Nabokov. I did a review of this one. All I'll say is that for a long while, a lot of people told me that this was a very funny book, and it's not. It is amusing and witty, but not funny. It's okay. In the Blood, collection of poems by my friend Alan Hill. This is a very good collection of poems. I will provide a link to Amazon if you would like to buy it. This was written about his brother who is schizophrenic. So these poems are very personal and very, you can feel the sincerity and the pain. At the end of the video, I will tell you a personal story about my connection with poetry and how I met Alan Hill. And if you want to stick around to hear kind of a long personal story, then I'll have that at the end, okay? I'm drinking beer, so it might be good. The Natural by Bernard Malamud. Wow, I did not like this book. What I didn't mention in my review was that a long time ago, like 20 years ago, I read The Fixer by Bernard Malamud. And that book I thought was really genius. I was in awe. Like, how is it I never heard of a this novel, which has such a striking name and such a strikingly named author? Why has no one told me about The Fixer? It stuck in my mind, and I always remembered Malamud. One day I have to get more and read more, because like the guy that wrote The Fixer, I need to read all of his stuff. So when I came back to Canada, I read The Assistant, and that was not too terribly good. And then I read this, which was even worse than The Assistant. So I still have this very high regard for Malamud because of The Fixer, but okay, this was his first novel. Maybe it was a learning process. A lot of authors, they start with the big one, like the first novel is that really strong one, but not in this case. This one, I wanted to make a review of this one, but I just can't put my finger on it. What I like about this novel. This is The Monkey's Wrench by Primo Levi. Last year, one of my favorite novels was Primo Levi's If Not Now, When. Such an amazing book. You really, that's a great book to read. So I was keen to read this one. I thought I was going to make a big review of this one, but I guess I'm not going to, because every time I try to think about what I like about this novel, I just draw a blank. I do like it. I can't say why. Perhaps if I read it a second time, it would be a lot more clear and concrete for me to make a review of it, but I can't imagine I'll be reading this for a second time anytime soon. It is a good book. I recommend it. Maybe start with this one if you've never read any Primo Levi, and that way you can move on to If Not Now, When, and then you could be, wow, okay, so much better. And the last book of April was Ali Smith, The Accidental. I really enjoyed this one. This was a very, very good book. That modern style where it's very clever, it's very well done, it's very well constructed. In the end, you feel that perhaps there is not a great deal of depth or gravitas, but you have to admire how well it is written. That's just how I feel about modern literature versus classic literature. Like when you read Shakespeare, when you read Dostoevsky, when you read, who's one that I like? When you read Balzac, when you read Joseph Conrad, you're really putting your hands on something very solid. And when you read the modern stuff, it feels a little bit not as substantial as the old stuff. Perhaps because the old stuff tended to be longer and it tended to be more concrete. Like you read a story beginning to end, you knew what happened. And the modern stuff is you don't know exactly what happens, things happen, and you have to put it together yourself. It is, I would say it is more intellectually done, but as for satisfaction, it's not quite the same. So that's what I read in April. May is going to be a better month, but again, I'm going to be starting at university, so it's going to have to be a lot of university books again, but hopefully they're going to be better than the previous semester. Okay, all right. Thanks for listening. Here is a long story about my relationship with poetry. When I started reading literature, I wanted to be a poet, and I was determined to be a poet. When was it? It was 1994. I was living in Ottawa in a small room in a house, and I had the front room with a lock and a toilet across the hall. So every time I had to go for a piss, I had to go to my toilet and unlock it. And it was a cold, miserable, ugly room. I feel sorry for my younger self when I even remember the conditions of how I used to live there. It didn't matter because I was a poet, and that's how poets live. They live in tiny, ugly, cold rooms. They take all of their nourishment from beer and alcohol and cigarettes and coffee. That is what I would do. I would buy a small case of beer, 12 bottles, and I would sit on the one piece of furniture that I had was quite a high chair, and I would write on the counter beside the stove and beside the sink, and I would write 3 hours a night, poetry, all night. And I didn't have any friends, I didn't have any social life, and I really didn't go anywhere. Sometimes I would smile to myself that in the space of a week, the only person I spoke to was the guy at the liquor store, but it was fine because I was a poet. One day it happened that there was going to be a poetry reading in this nightclub in downtown Ottawa. The nightclub was called Zaphod Bibelbrox, and the poetry reading series was called the Vogon Reading Series, and it was going to be a reading with an open mic. And I thought, here we go. I'm gonna show them that I've been writing poetry. So the poetry reading was at 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening. I was just so nervous all day Saturday. I'm reading my poems, I'm reading them, to make sure I really get them. And Sunday I was just shaking with nerves. I was so nervous. I'd never been on stage before. So I decided that it would be a good idea to get there early, 3 or even 4 hours early. The nightclub was empty. Like, if you've ever been to a nightclub in the daytime, it's one of the most depressing, soulless, empty places you'll ever see. This place wasn't quite empty. There were about 4 or 5 old guys sitting at the bar, smoking, watching the American football game. And there was this monstrous bartender named Big Chris, who I got to know very well, very quickly, because, well, I started drinking shots, and I would be buying shots for myself and for Big Chris. He liked Irish whiskey. I think I might have even been buying shots for the old guys. By the time the poetry reading came round, I was wildly drunk, but still holding myself together, I suppose. I don't really know, to be honest, but I think the adrenaline was still there. They passed around the sheet of paper. I put my name on it. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go up there. I went up on stage and I grabbed the microphone and I read my poems. I don't know if they were good. I don't think they were good, but they were good enough at the time. The result was that I met the Ottawa poets, and this quite changed my life at the time. I met Rob and Tamara and James and Warren. I will always remember these 4 people as the Ottawa poets because those were the 4 most talented and most interesting people that I met. Rob was the most hardworking and diligent of the poets. Rob wrote poetry every day, and he was constantly involved in a new publication. He was always trying to get people interested in new poetry readings. Every day he worked incredibly hard, and he still does to this day. Rob really put his heart into it. Tamara was, well, she was a little bit different. She had twin girls. They were quite young then. I think they were 4 or 5 years old, which was different because I didn't have any friends who had children at that stage. And she was going to university and studying law. She was intending to be a lawyer, which she did happen to become. And Tamara wrote good poetry. If I remember well, and I don't really remember well, she tended towards the feminist poetry, which was kind of awesome in the early 90s. The 90s was when feminism was quite strong and militant, and we're going to kick some ass. Then there was James. I think James was the most intellectual of the group. He was a computer technician, computer engineer, programmer. Like, he was very bright and intelligent, but not in a typical poetry sense. This was quite obvious in his poetry readings. Like, his poetry, it wasn't quite poetry, but it was always something brilliant and odd. Like, James would read the most bizarre things with the strangest twists that surprisingly good. So James was a funny one, and whenever he came to a poetry reading, it was very exciting because he was going to read something so peculiar. Then there was Warren. Warren was actually running the Vogon reading series, and it's hard to describe Warren because I never really knew him very well. Like, Warren soon left Ottawa. I heard more stories about Warren than I actually got to know him. So I'll just say that Warren was a loose cannon, and not in a happy way, in a way that being very conflicting with other people. He seems to enjoy conflict as a natural method of conversation. These Ottawa poets became my friends, and they invited me to parties. They told me about some small press publications that I should send my poetry to, and I did, and I got published, and things began to happen for me in Ottawa. I did more and more readings. I began to get a bit more well-known in the Ottawa poetry scene, and I had a lot of fun at the poetry readings. I probably had more fun than the audience did on several occasions. I went to Europe for 16 years. I came back to Canada. I moved to New Westminster, where I am today. Once again, I was at home, alone in my apartment, essentially friendless, and I thought, I know I know I'll go to a poetry reading, and that's how I will make friends in New Westminster. It worked once in Ottawa, but this time when I go to the poetry reading in Canada, now I'm older, I'm more mature, I've read hundreds of books, I've been living in Europe. I'll be like one of those mentors to all the young people at the poetry reading. Like all those young 20-year-old young Canadian poets, they're going to look at me like a shaman or a viceroy. They're probably going to be like, oh, tell us about Europe and read your poems. And oh my God, where did this guy come from? He's from Ottawa. He's from Europe. He's not from this place. And I'll have some friends in Canada. So I did go to a poetry reading. Without any exaggeration, it felt like I had walked into the day room of an old person's home, a room full of very elderly people. All of these old ones were quite giddy. It was their fortnightly program. Oh, today's the poetry reading day. Yesterday we were at the petting zoo, and the day before that we went to the swimming pool, and tomorrow is the day we have the meatloaf, and today's poetry day. But I thought, well, I'm here and I want to read my stuff. Who knows what will happen? All right, let's refrain from making any comments about those old ones' quality of their poetry. Let's refrain. I do want to make a comment. They don't watch my videos, so I could probably say anything I like. So at this poetry reading, there was a poet who was quite exceptionally good, and that was me. But there was one other one as well, and that was Alan Hill. Alan Hill. I do like poetry, and I've never completely given up on poetry or writing poetry. I still do, even though it's very infrequently. My idea of poetry is that there should be an image and there should be an emotion. That's what I want. An image, an emotion, and that's a poem. I have to talk about these poets. So all these old at the poetry reading, they were reading poems. Like imagine someone went into a class, a high school class, grade 9, grade 10, and they taught, oh, here's a poem, here's a poem. Oh, look at this. Let's take a poem and we'll cut it up with scissors and we'll throw it up in the air and we'll put it back together. And oh, look, it's a new kind of a, like a poem. Oh, look, a found poem. And like just all that silly bullshit that really doesn't take any intellectual work. It just feels like all of them read, A.A. Milne's Now We Are Six. That is the only poetry they have ever read in their entire lives. And from that, they think they can write poetry. And because they're like this little collective group, they all compliment each other. They all tell each other, oh, it's amazing, it's incredible. And they organize contests. They have publications. So it's like they're all just circling, like telling each other how great it is when it's really not even good, like not even mediocre. Like it's bad writing that they're doing. This one little one came in. Oh, I wrote a glossa. I'm so happy. Today I'm gonna read my glossa. Do you know what a glossa is? Yes, I do know what a glossa is. A glossa is something that you catch and you take it and you put it right up your ass. See? Glossa? Up your ass. Like that. Oh, look, I wrote a sonnet. All of the 14 lines, they all rhyme with the same, it's the same rhyme. 14 lines. It's not like A, B, C, D. No, it's A, all the way along. It's like a new kind of sonnet. Alan Hill wrote good poetry, and we became friends, and we are still friends to this day. I like to go over to his house because Alan is one of those guys with a massive record collection, and he has exquisite tastes in music. I like funk, disco, soul, blues. I like that stuff from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That gets my soul shining. He pulls this vinyl off of his shelves, and he's like, have you ever heard of this? No. And he puts it on, and it's just that beautiful music that I've never heard before in my life. This really uncommon, amazing stuff from the 60s and 70s. So that's my connection with poetry thus far. And it's okay if you go to a poetry reading and all of the poetry is really bad. It's kind of funny. That's the video. Jesus Christ, this video is going to be impossible to edit. Drinking beer all by myself. I wrote a glossa.